opportunity to quibble, he stuck out his right hand. "Thanks for dinner." Chester Landry shook hands. "Don't get used to it. Next time it's Dutch treat." Thatcher, planning for there never to be a next time, smiled as expected, then turned and headed down the street in the opposite direction from which he intended to go. He waited until Landry's car was out of sight, then doubled back. He looked in Hancock's storefront window. The advertisement was still there. He continued on, following the directions Bernie Croft had given him that first day. Along the way, he kept to the shadows. 5 minutes later, the picturesque facade of the Driscoll's house came into view. Lights were on in some of the downstairs rooms, including the parlor with the bay window, the doctor's office. Aware of Miss Eleanor Wise's seemingly uninterrupted vigilance, Thatcher didn't go any farther, but took cover behind the catty-corner neighbor's detached shed. He slid down the exterior wall of it, worked his butt around until he'd created a depression for it in the ground, and settled in to wait. What he was anticipating, he couldn't say. The sudden reappearance of Mrs. Driscoll? A surefire giveaway of the doctor's guilt. He was irrationally annoyed with Bill Amos for lending credibility to his notions about the physician. If the sheriff had instead laughed himself silly over them, Thatcher wouldn't be sitting here in the dark, swatting at mosquitoes, accomplishing nothing. Time passed. He whiled most of it away thinking about Laurel Plummer. She'd charmed Mr. Martin into increasing his order, and it seemed damned pleased with herself for having done so. Her features hadn't looked as strained as they had the other times Thatcher had seen her. The smile she'd given the cafe owner looked genuine. She'd been dressed different, too. Her skirt was shorter than any he'd seen her in before. It was nipped in at the waist, and right off he'd noticed the good fit of her blouse. He wished he'd thought of an excuse to touch her during the brief time she'd been in the cafe. As mouth-watering as her pie had been, Thatcher was certain her mouth would be even more delicious. He'd enjoyed the sight of her bottom wiggling its way through that door, and couldn't help thinking back onto what it had felt like when it had bumped up against his front during the rooster episode, as he'd come to think of it. The contact hadn't lasted more than a few seconds, but it had flooded him with lust then, and remembering it did now, not for the first time. He meant no disrespect. He had no control over the fantasies about her that came to his mind, some so vivid and arousing they justified Landry's insinuating grin. He wished he'd punched that slime mug. As the lights in the Driscoll house began to go out, he pushed the image of Laurel from his mind. The last light to be turned off was on the second floor, the bedroom, no doubt. Thatcher stood up and looked toward the old busybody's house. "I guess we can get to bed now." He slipped out of the cover of the shed and headed toward the boarding house, hoping he wouldn't be spotted walking the streets where he didn't belong, skulking around in the dark like a criminal returning to the scene of his crime. 25. Laurel pulled her Ford into the graveled drive that led around to the back of the house. Irv had told her always to park facing out toward the street in case she ever had to leave in a hurry. "It'll probably never happen, but you know." Tonight may be the night when taking the precaution would pay off. Although it wasn't something easily done, she executed the three-point turn and killed the headlights. She reached beneath the seat for the pistol Irv had insisted she begin keeping with her. She couldn't feature an instance where she would actually fire it, but it was a comforting weight in her hand now. Her heartbeat thumped as she made a rapid sweep of her surroundings, then took more time to probe the shadows for a possible ambush, seeking out anyone who might have followed her from Martin's Cafe, which had been the last stop on tonight's round, despite her claim of having more deliveries to make. As she'd pulled away from the alley behind the cafe, she'd had no indication that she was under anyone's surveillance. Nevertheless, during the drive home, she'd half expected someone to roar up behind her. She waited inside her car for several minutes longer, but no one showed himself. Nothing stirred. Weak with relief, she dropped the pistol in her lap, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and pressed her damp forehead against the backs of them. She took deep breaths. Of all people to happen upon, the perceptive Mr. Thatcher Hutton. While standing face to face with him, one of Mr. Martin's cooks was out back retrieving 4 jars of moonshine from the trunk of her car. At the sight of Mr. Hutton, her heart had almost burst. But despite the unexpectedness of their near collision, she'd recovered reasonably well, she thought now. Mr. Martin had kept his head and had given nothing away. Of course, he wasn't the novice that she was. Since the county had been dry for decades, Clyde Martin had been pouring illegal alcoholic beverages for drinking customers for as long as he'd been in business, or so Irv had informed her. Neither Mr. Hutton nor the man with him, whose name now escaped her, had seemed the least bit suspicious of her transaction with Mr. Martin or of the order he had placed for 3 pies, which, in the coded language they'd worked out between them, translated to that many pies plus twice that number of jars of corn liquor. She'd taken her money and run, getting a nod from the cook on her way through the kitchen that the transfer of fruit jars from her car to a hidden compartment in the kitchen had been conducted without detection. Nothing had gone awry. All the same, she felt she had escaped a close call. Deciding it was safe to do so, she turned off the engine and got out. She let herself into the house through the back door and went directly upstairs to her bedroom, relieved that she didn't have to explain her shakes to Irv, who was helping Ernie at the still tonight. As she entered the room, she left the light off, being more fearful of light than of the dark. She acknowledged that was standard criminal behavior. Hands still unsteady, she set the pistol on the dresser. The handgun was small enough to fit in her palm, but Irv had assured her that the business end of it would give pause to anyone with harmful intent. He'd also assured her that it wasn't the one Derby had used to kill himself. Feeling claustrophobic, she hastily undressed. When she was down to her chemise, she poured water from the pitcher into the wash bowl and sponged off a film of nervous sweat. Then, moving to the bed, she sat on the edge of it and bowed her head, if not in prayer, certainly in relief. Over the past several weeks, she had become so wrapped up in her exciting new enterprise that at times she had to pause and remind herself that she wasn't playing a high-stakes game where she was merely trying to out-trick an opponent. She was breaking the law. If caught, the penalty was steep. She did not want to go to jail, nor did she want to be responsible for Irv and Ernie being incarcerated. When she'd first laid out her idea to use bakery goods as a cover for moving moonshine, Irv had responded with guffaws. Then he'd put up stubborn resistance, followed by pessimistic predictions. But after talking herself hoarse, she'd finally won his grudging support to try it. "Just for a time. If it doesn't work, I'll stop." He'd retorted, "If it doesn't work, we'll all be behind bars." Clyde Martin, the restaurateur, had been the logical choice for their first prospective client. "He used to keep a bootleg stock," Irv had told her. "So long as it was only a state infraction and a fine if caught. He poured bourbon and scotch on the sly and called it Mama's Sweet Tea. He bought his moonshine from me, but the new law spooked him. He stopped buying and, as far as I know, has gone completely dry. I don't figure he's a convert to abstinence, though. Might be worth me going to see him." "Let me." Irv had argued, but ultimately relented. "All right, but don't take this wrong, Laurel. When you go soliciting, wouldn't hurt if you girlied up some." "Girlied up? What does that mean?" "You know what it means. Every woman in the world knows what it means." "I'm not soliciting at Lefty's." "Alls I'm saying is, you might want to throw away those baggy old shirts of Derby's and fix yourself up to be more girlified." She'd spent that evening taking in the waistlines of garments that she'd let out during her pregnancy. As an afterthought, she'd also taken up the hemlines 1.5 inches. She'd ironed a blouse with a front placket flanked by strips of lace and had dusted off her best hat. She'd timed her arrival at the cafe during the lull between the midday meal and dinner. She gave the busboy her name and asked to see Mr. Martin. After getting clearance, he'd escorted her to a cramped office off the kitchen. When she'd walked in, Clyde Martin had been standing behind his desk, looking the picture of benevolence. "Mrs. Plummer, I'd like to express my sincere condolences for your—" She'd cut him off. "You're losing money, Mr. Martin." I beg your pardon?" "Try this." She'd taken a mason jar of moonshine from her tote bag, strode forward, and set it on the paper-littered desk. "And this." Also from the tote, she'd produced a slice of apple pie wrapped in wax paper and set it beside the jar. "You need to be offering both in your cafe. I'll come by tomorrow to work out the particulars of a deal. Have a pleasant afternoon." She'd left him with his mouth agape. When she'd returned the following day, Mr. Martin had been eager to negotiate terms. He'd soon learned that she was no shrinking violet, further weakened by grief. Settling on a price, he'd placed an initial order for 2 pies and 4 jars of moonshine. "I'll come by twice weekly to deliver the products and take your next order," she'd told him. As they shook hands on the deal, he'd said, "I thought you were going to apply for a waitress job." "This pays better." Initially, Irv had kept up his route and the handyman cover, but once the new still was in operation, she'd suggested that she take over his deliveries. "I could drive your route on the days I don't bake." "You can't drive my truck." "Why not?" "It's a truck." She'd given him a roll of her eyes. "I could drive it, but you make a valid point. It would attract unwanted curiosity. Instead, what if you built some kind of false floor in my car the way you did in your truck?" He'd fashioned a false bottom in her trunk, creating a hidey hole underneath, which she padded with an old quilt. Thus outfitted, she'd begun driving his route. As she became better acquainted with the roads and back roads in the area, she'd gone further afield, scouting for new opportunities. She'd picked up 2 cafes in 2 different towns, both of which had been customers of Irv's before becoming gun-shy of the Prohibition law. In addition to delicious pies, cobblers, and corn whiskey, she'd promised her customers utmost discretion. As Irv was leaving one evening to work at the still, she'd approached him with another idea. "What about Logan's Grocery?" "What about it?" "As a possible broker." "Hell, it'd freeze over first. A nicer man you'll never meet. Logan extends credit even to folks he knows will take a long time paying, but he's a staunch teetotaler. His wife was the standard bearer for the local temperance society." "Does he sell fresh-baked goods in his store?" "Not that I know of." "He should, don't you think? I'll pay him a call and take samples." "I just told you, Laurel, I saw a notice in his window that he offers delivery service for a small charge." "That's recent." "Who makes the deliveries?" "A couple of young men. Twins, in fact. Davy and Mike O'Connor." "Are they teetotalers?" He'd scoffed. "They worked in the pool hall until it was forced to shut down. A campaign led by Mrs. Logan, by the way. I guess Logan felt bad about the twins losing their livelihood. He hired them to deliver groceries." It took several days for her to secure an interview with the busy grocer. As Irv had said of him, he was extremely polite and highly complimentary of the samples of pie she'd brought for him to try. Even so, he'd declined. "I would like to stock them, Mrs. Plummer, but the problem is a shortage of shelf space. I'm at full capacity." She'd made a sound of regret. "That is unfortunate, because I notice that all the baked goods you carry are factory-made and packaged." After a strategic pause, she'd added, "There's nothing wrong with that, of course." At that, his smile had slipped a bit. The next day, she'd gone back and told him, with rehearsed animation, that she had slept on his dilemma and believed that she had a solution. I could make up a menu of my pies. You display it and take orders. The pies will be delivered from my kitchen directly to the customer. You never have to touch the goods, and they won't take up your valuable shelf space. How would you get the orders? You could telephone them in to me. Do you have a telephone? I will by tomorrow. Her cheekiness had made him smile. I think this idea is growing on you, Mr. Logan. You certainly have my interest, and I admire your initiative, which is rare in a young and recent widow. But we haven't yet talked terms. Acting girlified, she'd smoothed her hands over her skirt nervously, then had pretended to summon the courage to open the bidding. For each pie order you submit, I'll give you 10%. 15. 15? My 2 deliverymen are kept busy during store hours. Your deliveries will have to be made after closing. I'll have to pay them extra. After-hours deliveries were what she'd hoped for, but she'd pursed her lips as though she hadn't considered this stumbling block. Perhaps just one could work overtime? Perhaps they could swap off. They're twins, inseparable, and they work as a unit. One drives their truck and waits, while the other runs the delivery to the customer's door. It's a very efficient system. With the 2 of them working together, it takes only half as long to make the deliveries. Because they're paid by the hour, it's actually more economic to have both on the payroll. She'd appeared impressed by his business savvy, but crestfallen by how it affected their deal. I see. Well, I'll give you 2% more to cover that expense, for a total of 12. 15. 13. 15. She'd been prepared to give him 20. Her cash crop wasn't pies, it was whiskey. You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Logan. I'll agree to 15%. He beamed. Then she jerked the rug out from under him. But we haven't yet shaken on it. There is a matter that concerns me, because I can't take any chances with my reputation as a businesswoman. I'm sure you understand. Of course. What's the nature of your concern? Your deliverymen. My father-in-law told me they used to work in a pool parlor. Are they presentable? Do they have integrity? Can I trust them? What Mr. Plummer told you is correct. They went through a wild phase, as young men are wont to do, but they've been tempered by my influence and that of Mrs. Logan. I've received no complaints from customers about their comportment. I wouldn't have them in the store if I thought they were dishonest. I'll summon them right now so you can meet them. No, if they know employment is riding on the introduction, they'll be on their best behavior, won't they? I'd rather see them in action, when they don't know it's an audition. As I leave, I'll pick out some grocery items and opt to have them delivered. If I approve their service and manner, you'll get your 15%. She'd straightened her backbone. But if, in my opinion, they're unsuitable for any reason, I'll hire someone else and pay him out of my share, in which case your percentage will be reduced to 13%. That's the deal, Mr. Logan, non-negotiable. I'm agreeing because I'm confident that the O'Connor twins will work well for you. Laurel had been confident of that herself. That evening, Davy O'Connor had showed up at her front door, a box of groceries balanced on his shoulder. He flashed her a winning smile. Mrs. Plummer, good evening. Whenever you come into the store, the very sight of you makes my day. But in this gloaming light, you look a vision. You're... Cut it out. Mr. Logan went for it. Have Mike drive around to the back. I baked a strawberry and rhubarb pie for our celebration. Her deal with the O'Connor brothers had been struck even before she had approached Logan. Irv had been downright apoplectic when she'd advanced her idea to use the twins. They're crazy kids, rambunctious and reckless. Wish I'd never told you about them. Well, you did. Please arrange a meeting. Davy and Mike would have been interchangeable except for Davy's front tooth, which at some point in his boyhood had been chipped by a fist thrown by Mike. Both were handsome, flirtatious, and devilishly witty. Laurel liked them instantly. Irv had informed them that the meeting was to discuss the peddling of moonshine. Already enticed, the two had been eager to hear what Laurel had in mind. Gathered around the kitchen table, she'd gotten down to business. "We need runners to move our product. You seem qualified."
"Count us in," Davy had said, winking at her. "We like excitement, right, brother?"
"We only went to work in that bloody store because we need to eat." Laurel had explained why they would need to continue working at the store. "At least for the time being, we need the cover of a legitimate business." The twins had looked at each other, obviously troubled. Speaking for both, Davy had said,
"You know the Logans walk the straight and narrow."
"I've told her that," Irv had said.
"Mrs. Logan is trying to save our souls."
Mike had grinned when he said that.
"Being Catholic is failing in that regard, according to her."
"So when I approach Mr. Logan, I should—"
"Act the prude, Lady Laurel."
"I'll keep that in mind." When she'd told them her plans for expanding the business, they'd surprised Irv and her by contributing ideas of their own.
"All those men who used to hang out at the pool hall have worked up powerful thirsts, Mrs. Plummer. We can sell them your whiskey, whether or not they buy the baked goods."
"But we'll push your pies too," Mike had said, as though pledging fealty. As hoped, Mr. Logan's customers had gone wild for Laurel's pies. The twins delivered them after hours, and while at it, peddled moonshine to standing customers. 2 weeks into their sideline, the twins had asked for another meeting with Irv and Laurel. Davy had acted as spokesperson.
"One of our friends from the pool hall is working up in Ranger. He says if we deliver your pies up there, he could sell them for $1 a slice."
Irv had dismissed that with a harumph.
"That ain't worth the bother of the price of gasoline. It's 70 miles one way."
Mike had said, "If, along with the pies, we delivered 5 gallons of whiskey."
5 gallons? "Every other day."
Davy had turned to Laurel and winked. Irv and she had given the O'Connors the go-ahead. Wearing their St. Christopher medals for protection, they'd begun making trips to places where angels feared to tread. Irv and Ernie had difficulty keeping up with the demand. And so had Laurel. A second oven had become necessary. She'd applied at the First National Bank for a loan. The bank officer, a long-standing customer of Irv's moonshine, had approved the note. To accommodate the new appliance, Laurel had moved their dining table from the kitchen into the unfurnished dining room. Between making deliveries and baking, she'd become so busy that hours would go by without Pearl crossing her mind. Her marriage to Derby seemed to have belonged to another woman in another life, far removed from the one she was living. But as exhilarating as this venture was, it came with constant threats to her newfound independence, even to her life. She'd had a shocking reminder of that tonight, when once again she'd crossed paths with Thatcher Hutton. Recently, on a trip out to the still to deliver supplies to Ernie, as they passed the cutoff to the shack, she'd casually remarked to Irv that it seemed a long time ago since Mr. Hutton had wandered into the yard asking for directions. Irv had said,
"If he wandered, and if it was directions he was after."
Her father-in-law still had Thatcher typed as a man who was polite, quiet, calm, and deadly. Now, as she huddled on the side of her bed, Laurel wondered if the cowboy who broke horses was a guise for a government agent who broke up stills. On the front page of today's newspaper had been a picture of a still in northeast Texas near the Arkansas line that had been discovered and destroyed by state and federal law enforcement officers, unsmiling men with firearms and stern resolve. They'd been grouped around the disassembled still and busted casks, spilled corn liquor pooling around their boots, and the handcuffed men sitting on the ground. The photograph had been staged to make a point, to send a warning to current or aspiring distillers of illegal whiskey.
Was Thatcher Hutton one of the snitches that Irv had warned her to be wary of? Had he come to the shack that day looking for a still? Did he suspect her of doing precisely what she was doing? Was that why he always regarded her with such intensity? Despite the summer heat that had collected in her bedroom during the afternoon, her arms broke out in gooseflesh. She clumsily removed the pins from her bun and let it unfurl down her back. Ordinarily, the release felt good, but tonight the scene in the cafe had left her nape and shoulders knotted with tension. She folded back the bed covers and slid in beneath the top sheet. She settled her head on her pillow, closed her eyes, and tried willing herself not to dwell on the encounter. But her mind replayed the incident anyway. Had she done anything that might have given her away? Should she tell Irv about it? No, absolutely not. He would make far more of it than it warranted. He would say that she hadn't just bumped into any man during a delivery, she'd bumped into that man. As reluctant as she was to admit it, her father-in-law would be right. Whatever else he was, Thatcher Hutton was no ordinary man. And neither was her middle's flighty reaction to the very sight of him. 26. "What are you doing out here?" Randy asked as he clomped up the front steps of the boarding house.
"Too early to go to bed. Just taking in the air,"
Chester Landry replied. He lazily fanned himself with a folded newspaper.
"You appear to be drunk."
Randy laughed and plopped down into the chair beside Landry's. "As a skunk."
"Fun evening?"
"Fun and frolic, my friend." He chortled over his alliteration. Landry shushed him. "Lower your voice. Everyone else has turned in for the night." Everyone except for him, Randy, and Thatcher Hutton, who'd yet to return to the boarding house since they'd bade each other goodnight at the cafe. Landry couldn't help but wonder if his dinner guest had cut out on him in order to follow the widow home. He made a mental note to pursue that later, but right now, his focus was more on the indiscreet and talkative Randy Wells.
"Who were you frolicking with?"
Randy leaned across the arm of his chair and crooked his finger. Landry moved closer. Randy said, "The public library hosts a Bible study every Tuesday night for young singles."
"What's to whisper about?"
Randy giggled. "What's to whisper about is what happens after Bible study." Landry pretended that was the most delicious piece of information he'd ever heard.
"Do tell."
"Those young ladies who sing in church choirs on Sunday are just dying to be led astray on Tuesday. So me and some other guys..."
"Like who?"
"Davy and Mike O'Connor. Know them?"
"I don't believe so."
"You'd know if you did. They're twins. Anyhow, they've joined the Bible study because they work for Deacon Logan, and his wife is practically a missionary. He hiccuped, then waved his hand. "Doesn't matter. Tonight, we treated a few of those young ladies to all the sin they could handle."
"You and these O'Connor brothers?"
"They are my kind of folk, if you know what I mean." He bobbed his eyebrows.
"Drunk and disorderly?"
Randy roared with laughter. "Shh! Oh, sorry." He pressed his index finger vertically against his lips.
"You know what?"
Landry said, as though he'd had a sudden inspiration, when actually he'd been planning this since his talk with Mayor Croft about Randy and his loose tongue.
"I could use some diversion. I had a rather dull evening tonight with Mr. Hutton."
"Tight-lipped, isn't he? Good at cards, though. Do you think he cheats?"
"If he does, he's good. I haven't caught him at it."
"No, me neither. Lost $5 to him." Landry pushed out of his chair.
"Come on."
Randy stood up, swaying. "Where are we going?"
"For a drive. Did you sinners drink all your hooch?"
"Still have half a jar under the seat of my car."
"Then let's go in it."
He threw his arm across Randy's shoulder.
"But I'll drive."
27. Dusk was easing into full-blown darkness when Bill Amos came out of his headquarters and headed toward his car. Thatcher had been waiting for this opportunity to speak to him in private. "Bill?" The sheriff turned as Thatcher materialized out of the wide band of shadow under the eaves of the building.
Hey, Thatcher, what's doing?
"Got a minute?" Bill glanced back toward his office, hesitated, then asked,
Have you had supper?
"No?"
Me neither, and Mrs. Amos is hosting bridge tonight. Get in.
Thatcher went around to the passenger side. Once on the road, he asked, "What's your wife's name?"
Daisy. Her bridge club meets one night a month.
"Does she know how to play poker?" Bill laughed.
Not with you, she doesn't.
After a beat, he said,
I'm glad she's having the group at the house tonight. She doesn't entertain as often as she used to.
That had sounded like a loaded statement. Thatcher waited for him to expand. Bill cleared his throat.
Daisy isn't always up to socializing. She has declines, a heart condition.
"I'm sorry to hear that."
Yeah, well, you know, life.
He gave Thatcher a weak smile.
How's it been treating you lately?
"Can't complain. Me and Ulysses have finally resolved our differences. His owner is picking him up later this week."
Will he take to another rider?
"We'll see." Bill chuckled.
I wouldn't want to be the first to try. Did you fill that last stall?
"I've got a waiting list." Bill removed his pocket watch and checked the time.
I have a hankering for a juicy hamburger. Have you been to Lefty's yet?
Thatcher shook his head.
Then you're past due.
He tucked his watch away and settled into his seat.
Did you wait in the dark to see me so you could ask my wife's name?
"Nah." Thatcher exhaled heavily and propped his elbow on the door ledge. "I was wondering if you had talked to that woman, Dr. Driscoll's patient who had the breech birth." Bill gave him a sharp look, swerving in the process. The driver of an oncoming vehicle tooted a warning. Bill waved an apology as he passed a jalopy of a truck with two young men inside.
Mrs. Plummer's delivery boys.
Thatcher reacted with a start. Her delivery boys? Bill told him about the arrangement Laurel had made with Logan's grocery. Although Thatcher turned his head aside and pretended to be absorbed in the passing scenery, he listened with avid interest.
I hear her pies are selling like hotcakes, Bill said. No pun intended.
"I knew she'd gone into the business. One night last week, I had supper in Martin's Cafe. While I was there, she came in to deliver an order."
Really? To Clyde?
"Uh-huh."
Huh.
"What?"
Nothing, just that Clyde has always used his own cooks for everything.
"I guess he prefers her pies to theirs."
Guess so. Have you sampled her wares yet?
Thatcher looked over to see if there was an innuendo behind the question, but Bill had his head turned away, signaling to make a left turn. "I had a slice of pecan pie."
Was it good?
"Damn good." Bill had turned onto a road leading away from town.
We've got a ways to go before we get to Lefty's, he said. Tell me why you asked about Gabe Driscoll's patient.
"I've been watching his house every night for a week." Bill looked across at him with both consternation and curiosity.
What for?
Thatcher started by telling him about his dinner out with Chester Landry. "He's a shoe—"
I know who he is and what he claims to be.
"Claims to be?"
Are y'all pals?
"Hell no," Thatcher said. "I don't trust that grin of his."
So why'd you go to dinner with him?
"I didn't have a reason not to." Bill gave him a knowing glance.
You want to find out what he's hiding behind that grin.
He was right, but Thatcher didn't want to admit it. "Anyway, that's why I was in the cafe when Mrs. Plummer came in. By the time Landry and I had finished our desserts, I'd had about all of his company I could stomach. I opted to walk back to the boarding house. But I didn't go straight there. I circled around to the Driscoll's place."
Again, what for?
"Shit, I don't know. But after you and I talked about the dock, the coincidences that took place that night, I couldn't get it off my mind. I just felt led to go over there, take a look-see. I didn't really expect to uncover anything, didn't even know what I was looking for. But I went back the next night, and I've been going back. He paused. Did you question that woman again?
Her name is Norma Blanchard, and yes, I went straight from our conversation by the creek to talk to her about that night.
And?
Have you changed your mind about becoming a deputy?
No.
Then I shouldn't be discussing an open investigation.
You called it open-ended. Doesn't mean the same as active, does it?
Bill waved that away with annoyance. Speak your mind, Thatcher.
They were in the countryside now. They passed barbed wire fenced pastures with horses and cattle grazing, farmhouses lit by lamps and lanterns instead of incandescent bulbs, chalky rock formations. Thatcher took time to choose carefully what he was going to say and how he was going to phrase it. He turned slightly in his seat to better address Bill and gauge his reactions. Describe Norma Blanchard.
Late 20s, I'd say. Dark hair, parted down the middle, all knotted up and back. Not pretty, but just say men would take to her better than women would.
She came to the doc's house last night. Bill gnawed on that as Thatcher figured he would.
After office hours?
At 11:28. He shrugged.
Could have been an emergency.
Thatcher said nothing, just looked at him.
But you don't think so?
No, I don't, Bill. She was dropped off at the street and seemed in perfect health, best as I could tell by the way she walked.
How'd she walk?
Like she owned the place. Knocked on the door the same way. The dock was up, or at least his bedroom light was on. Drapes were drawn, but there was light around the edges of them, which was why I hadn't left yet. He came to the door in his pajamas and a bathrobe. It appeared to me that he wasn't altogether happy to see her. In fact, when she tried to step inside, he blocked her. They didn't raise their voices or tussle, but there was a lot of angry gesturing. Eventually, he let her in. Bill kept his eyes on the road and didn't comment, so Thatcher continued. I don't know where they spent their time while inside, because no other lights in the house came on. If she'd come for medicine or something, they'd have gone into his office, don't you think?
How long did she stay?
Almost an hour. The car came back at 12:15. She walked out to it and got in. It drove off. A few minutes later, the upstairs bedroom light went off.
She didn't have the baby with her?
No. Could have been in the car, I guess.
Did you see who was driving?
Another woman.
Her sister, no doubt, Patsy Kemp. They live together. Mrs. Kemp's husband is off working somewhere. Montana, Alaska, somewhere like that. Which is why Norma is living with her, I guess.
Norma isn't married?
I didn't ask, but she wasn't wearing a wedding band and no reference was made to a husband.
Did you see the baby?
He was sleeping there in a basket in the living room. She showed him off to me. If he was born out of wedlock, she gave no sign of being ashamed about it.
What did she tell you about Dr. Driscoll?
What she'd told Scotty when he questioned her, which matched what Gabe had told us. He paid her a house call earlier in the day while she was still in labor. On his way home from Lefty's, he stopped there again to check on her. In the meantime, she'd given birth and all was well.
Thatcher took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. I feel like a damn peeping Tom.
It feels like that sometimes.
What feels like that?
Detective work?
That's not what I was doing.
Then you are peeping Tom. Swear to God, Thatcher, I ought to arrest you again.
Thatcher shot him a look.
Well then, tell me, what's compelled you to go over there every night for the past week?
I wish now I hadn't. I wished I'd left it alone.
No, you don't.
Thatcher gave him another hard look, which didn't dent Bill in the slightest. He said,
If you had wanted it left alone, you wouldn't have told me about Norma's late-night visit.
Thatcher didn't have a chance to form a comeback. They had arrived at the roadhouse. There were 20 or 30 vehicles parked around it, and yet only weak light shone through the screened windows. Built of unpainted clapboard, the structure was as square as a box of saltines and totally without character. A set of warped wood steps led up to the entrance. It looked nothing like the speakeasy Thatcher had been to in Norfolk, which had had the classy veneer of the haberdashery and an aura of intrigue.
"You seem let down," Bill remarked.
Thatcher shrugged. Doesn't have much atmosphere.
"Oh, it's got atmosphere."
He reached beneath his car seat and came up with a Colt revolver.
"A hostile atmosphere."
28. Bill passed the pistol to Thatcher.
"It's loaded."
Will I need it?
"Depends."
He didn't say on what. Even though Thatcher had been told the gun was loaded, he checked the cylinder before pushing the pistol into his waistband and buttoning his jacket over it. He and Bill got out of the car and walked toward the porch steps where two men sat smoking. As they went around them in order to reach the door, Bill addressed the men by name. They kept their heads down and replied to his greeting with surly mumbles. The instant they stepped inside, the low rumble of conversation died. Bill acted as though he didn't notice and pointed Thatcher toward an empty table. They sat in adjacent chairs, both facing out into the room, their backs to the wall. Thatcher was about to take off his fedora when Bill said,
"Leave it on. Bad manners, I know, but the brim shades your eyes. Nobody can tell where you're looking."
Following Bill's example, Thatcher left his hat on. Once his eyes had adjusted to the dim interior, made even foggier by tobacco and grease smoke, he surveyed the place, trying not to noticeably move his head. The bar ran almost the full length of the back wall, but behind it, the shelves were stocked with bottled soft drinks only. A gramophone in the corner emitted scratchy, tinny music. Only a few of the tables were occupied. Thatcher remarked on the small crowd. "Doesn't match the number of vehicles outside."
"And you say you're no detective?"
A steep staircase was attached to the far wall. Thatcher noticed a hulking figure leaning against the banister halfway up, smoking a cigarette and staring at him through the haze. Bill said,
"I see you've captured Gert's attention."
"That's Gert, the madam?"
"What did you expect? A red velvet dress, an hourglass figure?"
Lowering his voice, Bill added, "Careful how you answer. Here comes her other half." The man approaching their table had the proportions of a praying mantis and the lips of a lizard. They formed a tight seam between his beak of a nose and pointed chin. A smile would have looked out of place on such a face, but in any case, he didn't fashion one.
"Sheriff, been a while." "Hello, Lefty. How are things?"
He jutted his chin toward Thatcher.
"Who's he?" "Meet Thatcher Hutton. He's new to town."
"Hutton, you're the one what shot the snake."
"He's a horse trainer," Bill said amiably.
"Horse trainer." He said it like he'd been told that Thatcher performed a high wire act in the circus.
"Well, welcome to Lefty's."
Thatcher didn't say anything, just gave a bob of his head. Bill placed their order for 2 hamburgers and cold Coca-Colas.
"Coming up."
Thatcher watched Lefty's progress back across the room. Midway, he was intercepted by his wife. They had a brief exchange, then Lefty continued on toward the grill behind the bar, while Gert made her way toward their table. Through the soles of his boots, Thatcher could feel the vibration of her heavy tread. Unlike her husband, who looked like he could be snapped in two as easily as a toothpick, Thatcher didn't think Gert could be knocked over with a tank like those he'd seen on the battlefront. When she reached them, she sized him up.
"Thatcher, huh?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"Never knew nobody with that name. Who are your people?"
"You wouldn't know them."
"Try me."
He gave her a one-sided smile that didn't show teeth.
"I wouldn't know them."
Still appraising him, she took a drag of her cigarette, then leaned over and ground it out in the ashtray in the center of their table. She blew a plume of smoke out of the corner of her mouth. Turning her attention to Bill, she said, "What are you doing here?" Bill, who'd checked his watch again, pocketed it.
Hello to you too, Gert. I'm here for a hamburger. Also to ask after the girl.
Which?
You know which, Gert.
She huffed a gust of stinky breath.
That Wally Johnson, jug-eared little bastard, ruined her face. Her arm's healing all crooked, and she can't see out one eye. Is she still here?
She hitched a thumb over her shoulder. Thatcher and Bill looked in the direction she'd indicated. A young woman, with her arm in a sling, was flipping meat patties on the grill, while Lefty was uncapping Coke bottles. Gert was saying, "Her name's Corinne. Out of the goodness of my heart, I'm keeping her on, even though she ain't much use to me upstairs no more. But some men, if they're that hard up, ain't all that particular about looks." She gave Thatcher a sly glance. "You interested? You can have half an hour at a cut rate." Bill said,
Gert, if you openly solicit, I'll slam down your operation upstairs.
He spoke in a low voice that thrummed with warning. Her eyes, set in folds of ruddy fat, narrowed to slits. "Less'n you forgot you and me have a deal, Sheriff."
Only as long as we both keep up the pretense that this isn't a low-rent whorehouse.
Beg your pardon, it ain't low rent.
All I'm saying is, don't forget the terms of our deal, or I'll forget we have a deal. I'll close you down and you'd lose a shitload, what with all the roughnecks racing down here from Ranger every Saturday night."
He looked over at Thatcher.
"They've struck oil up there."
"Yeah, I've heard."
"Despite the distance they have to drive, the oil field workers have been a boon to Gert's business."
"I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Bill snickered.
"The hell you don't. They're a wild bunch, those boys. I hear you've got them lining up in the hall and making them bid on who goes next. That's begging for trouble."
Then, after a beat, he said in a steely undertone,
"Keep things under control, Gert, or our deal is off."
She took a challenging stance. "I got iron control."
"You didn't the night Wally battered that girl."
Bill eyed her keenly.
"Or was that under your control?"
Looking up at her from beneath the brim of his hat, Thatcher noticed an instantaneous slackening of the woman's smirk, her rapid blinking. Bill had struck a nerve, but she recovered quickly. "Chew good, Sheriff. It'd be a damn shame if you choked to death on your burger." She looked again at Thatcher. "Any of my girls would be tickled to see you." She turned and lumbered off.
"What, Thatcher? I think she took a shine to you,"
Bill said. He was still laughing under his breath when Lefty brought over their food. After one bite, Thatcher understood why the burgers had earned their reputation. He'd polished his off in no time and was about to comment on the tastiness when the crack of a gunshot silenced him. Reflexively, he dropped sideways out of his chair onto the floor and pulled the pistol from his waistband. Much more calmly, Bill stood up and drew his weapon.
"That was only the warning shot, Thatcher, but any from now on you should take seriously."
"Warning shot?"
"We're raiding the back room."
Bill left him and began swimming upstream of all the patrons who were hot-footing it toward the entry.
"I could use some help,"
he shouted back at Thatcher. Thatcher was furious at Bill and at himself for being so goddamn gullible, but he followed, pushing people aside before they could trample him. When he and Bill drew even with the staircase, Gert leaned over the banister and screamed, "I won't forget this, Sheriff! Fuck you!" Ignoring her, Bill slid into a narrow space behind the bar that accessed a door. He knocked on it twice with the butt of his gun. It was opened by Harold, who was breathing heavily. "Hell's broke loose!" From beyond the doorway came the sounds of pandemonium, swearing and shouting, grunts of pain, the splintering sound of breaking furniture, glass shattering. Bill turned and slapped his hand over Thatcher's chest.
Pin that on and consider yourself deputized.
Thatcher fumbled the star-shaped badge, pricking his finger on the pin.
You son of a bitch. Well, I guess I am, but...
A barrage of gunshots drowned out the rest.
Damn it!
Bill barged through the open doorway. Thatcher slid the badge into the breast pocket of his jacket as he followed the sheriff. Holding the Colt at shoulder level, barrel toward the ceiling, he entered the fray. Scotty had the man obviously responsible for firing the gunshots pinned face down on the floor. Bill was trying to wrestle away the man's handgun before he could fire another round. Harold was dodging the uncoordinated jabs of a broken beer bottle wielded by a man so drunk he could barely stand. Thatcher rushed over and bonked the drunk on the back of his head with the grip of his pistol. The man dropped the broken bottle and landed on the floor like a sandbag, face first. Harold said,
"That's twice I owe you. Thanks."
Then he dashed off to help other deputies whom Thatcher recognized but didn't know by name. They were swapping blows with some of the angrier, drunker customers. Others trying to avoid arrest were overturning tables, chairs, and each other in their mad scramble to exit through the single door at the back of the room. Some were making their escape by jumping through windows. Along with their male counterparts, a few women were kicking and clawing their way toward the nearest way out. A dozen or more people had bottlenecked at the exit. Thatcher noticed in the midst of them a familiar head of hair, so pomaded it looked like it had been painted onto his scalp. No sooner had he identified Chester Landry than the man managed to squeeze through the congested exit to the outside. Thatcher fought his way toward the door. Harold, he realized, was following in his wake, apprehending the people Thatcher shoved back toward him. When Thatcher reached the door, he bolted outside and tried to catch sight of Landry. Mad confusion was made even worse by the darkness and by the sudden blinding glare of headlights as people made it to their cars and peeled out in every direction. A car without headlights came speeding out of the darkness, missing Thatcher by a hair. Thatcher saw two autos collide in their haste to leave the area. Some drove over ground in the opposite direction of the road, leaving clouds of dust that further obscured vision. He didn't catch sight of either Chester Landry or his automobile, which Thatcher probably couldn't have identified anyway. But one vehicle did catch his eye, and it caused his heart to lurch. He ran over to it. No one was inside. He replaced the Colt in his waistband and ran full out back into the building, where the chaos continued. The deputies and Sheriff Amos were trying to restrain those still bent on escaping and to keep corralled those they'd halted. Above the cacophony, Gert was bellowing profane threats. Lefty was swinging a full bottle of whiskey at the head of a man he was calling a goddamn snitch, which his victim was frantically denying as he ducked each hazardous arc of the bottle. On his first sweep of the room, Thatcher didn't see whom he sought, but there were several men down, lying on the floor, either wounded or dead of gunshot. He rushed over to the first, who was cursing and clutching his thigh. He yelled, "I'm shot!" Thatcher squatted down and took a look. It would be spurting if it had clipped an artery. You have a handkerchief? The man nodded. Use it as a tourniquet. Tie it tight. You'll be all right. I'm dead, he wailed. You're not going to die. Hell, I ain't. My wife's gonna kill me. Thatcher left him and moved to another person lying motionless nearby. He was on his side, facing away from Thatcher. Fresh blood was spreading a dark blotch on the back of his shirt. There was no mistaking the bald pate, as round and shiny as a cue ball, fringed by wiry gray hair. Thatcher knelt and eased Irv Plummer onto his back. His eyelids fluttered open, but when he saw Thatcher, he scowled. Did you shoot me? Where are you shot? Under my arm. He raised his left arm, or tried to, but pain drained his face of color and he gnashed his teeth. Hurts like a son of a bitch. Put your right arm around my neck. I can make it my own self. Thatcher swore at him, then hooked Irv's right arm around his neck, put his shoulder to Irv's middle, and stood up with Irv draped over him. He felt the old man go limp. He'd fainted. Thatcher wove his way through the overturned tables and chairs toward the door, but it was slow going. The floor was littered with broken glass and slick with spilled liquor and blood. He'd almost reached the exit when, "Thatcher!" He turned to face Bill Amos, who asked, "Irv Plummer? Is he dead?" "No, but he's been shot." "How bad?" "I don't know. I'll take him to a doctor." "Put him in my car." "His truck is outside. I'll drive him in that. Can't leave it here. It's his livelihood." "Thatcher, I'm driving him." He turned to go, but Bill caught his sleeve. "When you told me that this wasn't your fight and that you were staying out of it, I knew better." Thatcher didn't waste time arguing with him. He pulled himself loose and left through the door. Most everyone had cleared the area. Only a few stragglers remained. He carried Irv over the rough ground with as little jostling as possible. When he reached the truck, he opened the tailgate and eased Irv off his shoulder and into the bed of it. Thatcher shook him slightly. "Where's your key?" Irv groaned, but he'd understood the question and patted his right pants pocket. Thatcher fished out the key, then adjusted Irv's legs and feet to clear the tailgate. "I saw you sitting with the sheriff." Thatcher turned quickly. Standing behind him was the young prostitute in the arm sling. She said, "You Law?" "No." "Gert said you probably was." "She's wrong." The badge in his breast pocket seemed to be branding him through his shirt. With a tip of her head, the girl indicated Irv, who was moaning and muttering incoherently. "Is he gonna die?" "I don't know." "If you'll take me away from here, I'll help you with him." "No, thanks." "I'm a good helper." "Thanks, but..." "Don't make me go back to Gert, mister. Please." Thatcher took in her misshapen jaw and the damaged eye. He mouthed a vulgarity used frequently in the trenches. "Get in." 29. Laurel was accustomed to Irv's truck clanking into the drive at all hours of the night, so when it did now, her subconscious registered that he had made it home, but she didn't fully wake up until there was thunderous knocking on the back door. She threw off the sheet, grabbed her housecoat, and pulled it on as she rushed downstairs. She didn't even bother to turn on the kitchen light before running to the back door and yanking it open. Even having been certain that the knocking didn't bode well, she still wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted her. Thatcher Hutton stood on the other side of the threshold. He was wearing the familiar black fedora, a blood-stained Henley undershirt, and dark trousers with a pistol stuck in the waistband. He was carrying Irv over his shoulder. "Your father-in-law has been hurt." Laurel stepped around him to better see Irv, who hung limply, his arms dangling lifelessly. "Irv?" She turned his face toward her and repeated his name. When he didn't respond, she cried out in alarm. "He's not dead, just unconscious." "He's bleeding." "He was. I stanched the wound." "What wound?" "He was shot." Aghast, Laurel looked down at the pistol in his waistband. "Not by me," he said. "Let's get him inside, see how bad it is." "We already know it's bad. He needs a doctor." "He refused a doctor." "Refused? How could he refuse if he's unconscious?" "Where should I put him?" "Back in his truck. I'll drive him myself." He took a breath, then, in a voice that brooked no argument, said, "Where to?" He seemed immovable. Realizing that further argument would be a waste of valuable time, she motioned, "The room behind the kitchen." Thatcher stepped inside and headed in that direction. She reached out to close the door, but a young woman with her arm in a sling was coming through. "The old man threatened to chop off Mr. Hutton's pecker if he took him to a doctor." She scuttled past Laurel and followed Thatcher into Irv's room. Laurel shut the door, then rushed to follow them, reaching the room just as the girl switched on the overhead light. Thatcher eased Irv off his shoulder and lowered him onto his back on the bed. Out of sheer desperation, Laurel prayed, "God, please no." She elbowed Thatcher aside and sat down on the edge of the mattress. She took hold of Irv's hand, squeezed it tightly, and exhaled in relief when he opened his eyes.
Hi, Laurel.
What in the world happened?
Ain't Hutton told you?
You need a doctor.
It ain't gonna be that bad.
You don't know that.
Fetch that jar of shine from my dresser drawer.
Which drawer? Thatcher asked.
Bottom.
On his way over to the dresser, he pulled the pistol out of his waistband and set it on the cushion atop Irv's barrel, then took off his hat and placed it over the gun. He eased his braces off his shoulders and let them fall to form loops over his hips. He found the jar of corn liquor, brought it over to the bed and screwed the lid off, then held it against Irv's lips while he sipped. After a few swallows, Irv relaxed his head on the pillow.
Don't fret, Laurel. Pour some of this whiskey in the bullet hole, smear it with a little coal oil, and cover it with a bandage. In a day or two, I'll be right as rain.
Coal oil?
Cures everything.
Irv gave her a woozy grin and helped himself to another sip of moonshine when Thatcher pressed the rim of the jar to his lips, then gave a grunt of satisfaction and closed his eyes.
Get on with it.
Thatcher turned to the girl. Corinne, think you can put a kettle on to boil?
Sure.
While you're waiting on it, gather up some things. Towels, tweezers, rubbing alcohol, bandages, some... I don't have any bandages, Laurel said, interrupting him. She resented his taking charge of her emergency with her father-in-law in her house. You'll have to cut strips of bed sheets, she said to the girl. Fresh ones are in the cupboard in the upstairs hallway. She rattled off where the girl could find the other items. The girl repeated the instructions to make sure she'd gotten them all, then turned to leave. In her haste through the door, she bumped into the jamb. Laurel had noticed that her right eye was swollen and partially closed. She was curious about her, but for the time being, she shelved her curiosity and asked the question uppermost in her mind. How did this happen? She was afraid that Irv had been assaulted at the still. What of Ernie? Irv made a limp motion with his hand, ceding the explanation to Thatcher, who asked her, "Do you know about lefties?" She gave a brusque nod. "The back room?" "I've heard about it." "Well, the sheriff raided it tonight. It was bedlam. Someone started shooting." "At Irv?" Although his eyes remained closed, Irv answered, "No." Laurel looked to Thatcher for confirmation. He said, "I don't know for sure, but I think it was random. He got a wild shot. I got him out of there quick as I could." "I appreciate that, Mr. Hutton. Thank you for seeing to him, but you don't have to stay. I'll take over from here." "You'll need help." "I'll manage." "I don't think the bullet is still in there, but the wound needs to be cleaned out. Have you ever dug around in a bullet hole?" The thought of it made her queasy. She gave a tight shake of her head. "It's nasty business," he said, "and through some of it, he'll probably have to be held down." Laurel was still clutching Irv's hand, though his had gone slack. His face was ashen. She understood that Mr. Hutton was right. Giving in to him smarted, but it wasn't only her pride at stake here. Irv's life was at risk. "All right, I accept your offer to help." "Good." She swiveled her head to look up at him. "But I don't like it." "I know. You don't want to be beholden." His gaze stayed steady on hers for several beats. Then he turned his attention to Irv. "Let's get him out of his shirt." The cloth had turned stiff with drying blood, front and back. Whenever they had to readjust his position to work his arms free of the sleeves, he hissed through clenched teeth. When the garment was off, Laurel wadded it up and tossed it into a corner. "This isn't going to be pretty," Thatcher said. He lifted Irv's left arm and removed a balled-up shirt from his armpit. It was more blood-soaked than Irv's had been. "Yours?" she asked, as she sent it the way of the other. "It was the only thing I had handy." He gave his shirt no heed as he assessed the raw, gaping wound. This is where the bullet came out. And went in where? On the back of his arm. Help me roll him over. Following his directions, she went around to the other side of the bed and helped him turn Irv toward her. Her father-in-law wasn't too drunk to spew some colorful expletives. "Sorry," Thatcher said to him. "Bullet went straight through a fleshy part of your arm. Best I can tell, it missed bones. All told, you're lucky." "Told you it weren't going to be bad. But right now, I ain't feeling so lucky," Irv grumbled. "Where's the whiskey at?" The girl moved like a whirlwind. She made several trips in and out of the room, depositing everything that she'd been sent to scavenge. She placed them on a table that Laurel had cleared for that purpose and had moved close to the bedside. Thatcher put the tweezers and scissors in a wash bowl and poured boiling water over them. While he organized the things they would need, Laurel stayed at Irv's side and plied him with moonshine from their own still. At one point, as Thatcher was packing towels beneath Irv's left side, he said to her, "Go easy on that whiskey. We'll need it for later." "There's plenty more." Then, realizing her slip, she added, "He keeps another jar hidden in the bottom of that barrel. He doesn't know that I know." Thatcher gave her a wry grin. "Before we're done, you and I may need a swig." "Don't be giving away my whiskey, Laurel," Irv mumbled into his pillow. "Or my secrets." She leaned down and whispered directly into his ear, "Our secrets, and I won't." When everything was ready and Irv was good and looped, Thatcher and she bathed their hands with rubbing alcohol. They worked on the entry wound first, since it was the minor one. Irv remained stoic. But when they repositioned him on his back, placed his arm above his head, and began to clean the exit wound, Thatcher had to restrain him, while Laurel tweezed out a scrap of his shirt fabric from deep inside. Irv yelped, swore, then fainted. He remained blessedly unconscious while they continued. At last, Thatcher said, "I think that's the best we can do." "We're going to leave the wounds open?" "You want to close them with stitches?" She shuddered. "I dread the thought, and I'm not sure closing them would be best anyway." "I don't advise it," he said. When she looked up at him, he gave a small shrug. "One time, one of the ranch hands got shot by a rustler as we were chasing him. The boss, Mr. Hobson, sent for a doctor. The doc got the bullet out and wanted to stitch up the hole. Mr. Hobson wouldn't let him. He said the cowboy might survive the blood loss, but then die of infection." "Did he live?" "Yeah, he did fine. Well, until he tried to ride a bull on a dare. He got gored. Bled to death after all." Laurel looked over to see if he was joking, but his brow was furrowed with concentration as he flooded Irv's wound with rubbing alcohol. She stood by to blot up the runoff, then covered the bullet holes with folded patches of cloth. Only then did the tension drain from her